Water thundered through the mine like a broken dam, trapping 9 men nearly 250 feet below ground, with the oxygen in their pocket of air slipping away by the minute. Above them, engineers and families raced against collapsing tunnels, freezing water, and a 6-hour countdown to certain death. How did these miners survive the impossible when every calculation said they wouldn't? On the evening of July 24, 2002, the men of the Black Wolf Coal Company carried their lunch pails and lamps into the yawning mouth of the Quay Creek Mine, Somerset County, Pennsylvania. They had done this routine hundreds of times before. The mine was only 2 years old, the tunnels familiar, the work hard but predictable. Underground, in the upper Kittening coal seam, the air was thick with coal dust, the walls black and glistening, the echoes of heavy equipment bouncing endlessly down the narrow shafts. To men like Randy Fogel, Dennis Hall, Tom Foy, and the rest of the 18-man crew, this was just another shift, another day in a dangerous trade they had learned to trust with cautious respect. But fate was waiting beneath their boots, hidden behind outdated lines on an old map that no one had thought to question. Around 8:50 p.m., 9 of the men worked in the section called One Left Panel. The steady groan of the continuous miner machine ate through the coalface, carving deeper into what their foreman, Randy Fogel, believed was safe rock. The map they carried showed nothing unusual. According to its faded notations, the space beyond the wall should have been solid coal, ready to be harvested. What no one knew was that the map was wrong, fatally wrong. Decades earlier, in the 1950s, another mine called the Saxman Coal Harrison, number 2, had been abandoned, sealed off, and then flooded by groundwater. 50 to 60 million gallons of water filled its void, hidden and pressurized, waiting for the first unsuspecting blade to break through. The men of Quay Creek were cutting directly toward that forgotten sea. It started quietly, almost innocently, a dark trickle seeping through the coal wall. Then, within seconds, the face collapsed, and a roar like a freight train filled the chamber. A wall of black water exploded into the tunnel, churning and smashing against timbers and rock. Lights flashed across terrified faces. Helmets bobbed in the chaos. The Saxman mine sat at a higher elevation, and when the seal broke, gravity and pressure created a siphon effect, sending millions of gallons cascading into the Quay Creek shafts with unstoppable force. The flood was instantaneous, merciless, and the men had only moments to react. Dennis Hall dropped his tools and ran to the mine phone. He knew 9 other men were working over 3,000 feet away in the 2 left panel, completely unaware of what had just happened. He seized the receiver, his voice cutting through the din. "There's water breaking through. Get out now. Get everyone out." His warning shot through the phone line like a lifeline. The second crew abandoned everything and bolted toward the exit, stumbling through the tunnels as water began chasing their heels. By 9:45 p.m., drenched and shaking, that group emerged onto the surface, their lives saved by one frantic phone call. But for the 9 men left behind in One Left, escape was already slipping away. The water level rose so quickly that passages that had been clear minutes earlier were submerged by the time they reached them. Twice, they tried to push through the 4-foot-high tunnels toward the exit shafts, crawling in freezing water, desperate to reach safety. Twice they were driven back, coughing, their lights bouncing off the rushing torrent. Each time, the current was stronger, the walls slick, the chance of drowning certain. Their lungs burned, their muscles ached, and their hope dimmed. The realization hit them like a hammer. They were cut off, sealed underground by an ocean pouring in with no mercy. There was only one option left: climb higher. Fogel directed his men into a chamber where the roof rose just enough to form a pocket of breathable air. It was a cramped, 4-foot-high cavity, barely large enough to hold 9 men crouched or lying shoulder to shoulder. The walls dripped with icy water, the floor submerged, the ceiling closing down on them like the lid of a coffin. The sound of rushing water surrounded them, echoing like the roar of an endless storm. They huddled together, panting, soaked to the bone, shivering as the temperature fell toward 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Fear clawed at them, but in that moment of panic, leadership mattered more than anything. Randy Fogel's voice, steady and firm, cut through the terror. He urged calm. He told the men they would find a way. He made them believe rescue would come. even though, deep inside, none of them knew if anyone above ground even realized they were still alive. The miners listened to the water rise and knew the clock had already started ticking. Oxygen in their small bubble would not last long. Every breath they took was a grain of sand slipping out of an hourglass they could not turn back. They crouched there in the darkness, lungs heaving, hearts pounding, and the weight of 240 feet of earth and rock pressed down on them with suffocating silence. What they could not see was that above ground, phones were ringing, alarms being raised, and families were being summoned to the Sipesville fire station. The story of 9 men sealed in darkness was about to begin. By 10:30 p.m., floodlights blazed above ground at the Quee Creek site. Pennsylvania State Police had secured the perimeter, and a crowd of anxious families was gathering at the fire station in Sipesville. News traveled fast in a mining community. Wives, children, parents, neighbors, all arrived with dread carved into their faces. Underground, their loved ones were huddled in a pocket of air, every second consuming the oxygen that stood between life and death. No one on the surface could know exactly where they were or if they had survived the breach, but in the chamber below, 9 men were already locked in a battle against the elements. The space they found was suffocatingly small. The roof forced them to crouch or lie flat, their legs cramping, their backs seizing with pain. The water was relentless, rising up to their chests before it finally stabilized, leaving them half submerged in black icy pools. The mine temperature plummeted toward 50 degrees, colder with every hour. Hypothermia was no longer a distant risk but an immediate threat. They pressed together back to back, arms linked, their body heat the only thing standing between them and unconsciousness. Every shiver was a reminder that their strength was leaking away. They could not move freely. They could not escape. All they could do was endure. The air was heavy, stale, thinning with each breath. They felt it in their lungs, in the heaviness of their heads, in the way speaking drained them more quickly than silence. They made a decision. Conserve oxygen. No idle talk, no wasted words. Speak only when necessary. Keep voices low. Save every molecule of air for survival. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Thirst parched their throats. Then, in the dim light of their headlamps, a small mercy appeared. Dennis Hall's lunch pail, floating toward them. He opened it with trembling hands, and inside was a corned beef sandwich, sealed and miraculously dry, along with a Pepsi. Tom Foy found 2 Mountain Dew bottles on a nearby machine, still intact. The men looked at the meager rations as if they were a feast. They divided everything into tiny portions, taking careful sips, tearing off slivers of bread, making each mouthful last as if it could stretch time itself. But even food could not silence the dread. They knew the truth. 9 men breathing in a space this small meant oxygen would run out in hours. They would suffocate long before hunger claimed them. Some reached for pencils and scraps of paper, scribbling notes to their families, tucking them into waterproof wrappings, desperate to leave a final goodbye if their bodies were ever recovered. Others tied themselves together with ropes, an unspoken pact that they would not be separated in death. If the mine became their tomb, they would rest as a family, united to the end. Yet, even in despair, flickers of hope broke through. Randy Fogel led them in prayer, his voice echoing softly against dripping stone. They prayed aloud and silently, words tumbling over one another in the darkness. They asked for strength, for deliverance, for their families to be protected. Each prayer was both surrender and defiance, a refusal to give in completely. They listened constantly, straining their ears for the faintest sound from above. Every creak, every vibration became a possible signal. Hours passed. The darkness pressed closer. Time stretched, distorted, felt like days though only minutes had slipped by. Their bodies weakened, but their will hardened. Above ground, engineers and rescuers were converging, scanning maps, measuring coordinates, trying to plot the miners' last known location. Trucks with drilling equipment rumbled into place. Workers shouted instructions. State officials gathered at Dormel Farms, the dairy that was becoming the center of an unprecedented rescue mission. But in the pit, none of this could be seen. The miners had only themselves, their faith, and the fading air in their fragile pocket of space. They were trapped in darkness, but they were not yet defeated. By the time most of Somerset County tried to sleep, the farm fields around Dormel Farms were a city of light and diesel noise. Troopers waved in lowboys, hauling generators, compressors, a drill rig that looked like a steel cathedral on wheels. Engineers unfolded maps against truck hoods and cross-checked them with GPS coordinates, recalculating over and over to shrink a room-sized target 240 feet below the surface into a circle they could actually hit. The initial math was brutal. 9 men, a small air pocket, roughly 6 hours of oxygen left, if the water kept rising and the pocket didn't expand. The only way to buy time was to punch a small hole first fast and drive compressed air into that cavity to halt the flood and feed their lungs. At 2:05 a.m. on July 25, the bit for a 6.5-inch hole began to turn, whining like a saw as it found purchase in soil, then shale, then the harder ribbons of rock that lay between the fields and the men. Underground, the miners counted the seconds in the scrape of their breath. The cold made everything ache. Bodies cramped and shook, voices faded to whispers to save air. Now and again, one of them would lift his head, lamp tilted to the ceiling, hunting for a sound that did not belong to water. On the surface, the drill chewed deeper, and by 5:06 a.m., it broke through with a hiss that turned into a roar. The trap chamber filled with a violent rush of sound as compressed air hammered down the pipe at roughly 920 cubic feet per minute. The men flinched at the blast, hot, dry, scalding air that hit their faces at nearly 197 degrees Fahrenheit before mixing and cooling in the pocket. The pressure climbed. Ears popped. The water at their chests stopped creeping upward and settled. In the din of the airstream, they shouted to one another and laughed a raw, disbelieving sound. For the first time since the wall failed, something was moving in their favor. They worked quickly to take advantage of the reprieve. Randy Fogel had them rotate positions against the warmest, driest surfaces, swapping out the men who shivered hardest, forcing everyone to sip, not gulp, whatever liquid they had in a measured cadence so no one spiked or crashed. They set a whisper schedule, short check-ins every 15 minutes, to make sure nobody slipped into the gray margin where hypothermia steals the will to answer. When the hot air stung their faces, they used sleeves and gloves as crude baffles, cupping hands to shield skin and nose. The pressure made the chamber feel strange, like being inside the hull of a boat, the waterline pinned by an invisible force. The miners banged gently on the roof and timbers with a wrench to send up a message through rock. 9 alive. Above, the drillers heard nothing but air and machinery. Below, the men took comfort in the way the water had stilled, in the new weight of oxygen in their lungs. What rescued their air did not solve their exit. A second operation had to begin immediately. Open a hole big enough to pull a man through, one at a time, without collapsing the weakened strata or drowning the chamber. The only machine within reach that could bore a 30-inch shaft through the geology they faced was sitting in Clarksburg, West Virginia. A convoy formed. Troopers cleared a path. The rig rolled north behind flashing lights. On the farm, volunteers marked a pad on firm ground, roped off cattle lanes, laid down matting to support the steel feet. When the rig arrived, welders threw sparks into the dark as they stitched together the first lengths of drill casing. The crew assembled a rescue capsule, a narrow, mesh-sided cylinder barely wider than a man's shoulders, testing the winch, the latch, the safety line, the brake that would catch if anything failed. Around them, the families kept vigil, hands wrapped around styrofoam cups, eyes fixed on the rig whenever the boom shifted. Hope became the new currency. People spent it carefully, in small, whispered installments. The rock fought back. 30 inches is not a paper straw. It is a tunnel, and tunnels wander if you let them. As the big bit cut downward, it hit hard bands that rang like iron and soft seams that grabbed and tried to twist the stem. At one point, the torque surged, a section of tool joint groaned, and the entire mast trembled as if it had been struck. The crew killed the rotation and held their breath until the vibration bled away. At another, drilling mud thinned unexpectedly and the bit began to chatter, threatening to skate off its line. They added weight to the string, adjusted speed, swapped a dulling crown for a fresh one under floodlights at 3 in the morning, hands burning on wrenches despite the night air. Every few feet they paused to log the cuttings, matching color and grit to the model on the maps. Accuracy was more than pride. A miss by a yard would punch into an empty pocket and flood it with air while the men remained inches away, still unreachable, lives evaporating on a technicality. Underground, The miner's world had shrunk to the circle of light in front of each face and the drumbeat of the compressor. The hot air steadied their breathing, but turned the chamber into a paradox, a place where skin burned and bones shook at the same time. They set small rituals to stay sane. A count to 100 in a low voice, a squeeze of the hand to say, "I'm here," a whispered roll call answered by 9 names. Hunger swelled until it faded into a dull, steady ache. Thirst came in waves, the kind that never fully receded. Someone suggested they tap a message in long and short knocks. Someone else said, "Save the strength." They chose the latter. But the idea itself of language that could travel through stone braced them. At intervals, a deeper tremor passed through the roof, a texture different from the sharp rasp of the small air hole. When it came, men smiled without meaning to. The big rig was moving. You could feel bigger teeth in the earth. Day flickered into day on the surface as operations divided and multiplied. Crews erected additional air lines to keep pressure steady even if one compressor failed. Pump trucks were staged to pull back any sudden surge of water if the balance shifted. Medics rehearsed hypothermia protocols in a farmhouse kitchen, while a miner's wife poured coffee for a state official she had never met. Reporters squinted into cameras. Pastors did their rounds of prayer like doctors, laying hands on shoulders at the edge of the cordon. There were moments of paralyzing doubt, rumors of new water seeping somewhere else in the mine, a shorted cable that killed power to the perimeter lights, a weather forecast that threatened rain heavy enough to turn fields to soup and stall heavy transport. Each time, someone solved the piece in front of them. A valve swapped, a generator refueled, a backup line stretched. Late on the second day, they lowered a small package down the narrow air hole. Chemical light sticks, a communication handset, a length of cord, a note in plastic that said, "We are here. Hold on." When the light burst and washed the chamber with its unnatural green, grown men cried. Voices on the handset were faint, patchy with static, but a human voice from above is a rope that reaches further than any drill stem. "We count 9, the rescuers said. "We count 9, the men answered. "Keep breathing, we are drilling. Hold on." The words were soaked in understatement. Beneath them was the pure fact that someone knew exactly where they were and was coming on purpose. The race became a calculus of inches. In the rig cab, a driller studied the readout and traced his finger down the column toward a number he could feel in his shoulders. He had drilled 1,000 feet for oil and gas, but this felt like threading a needle that bled if you missed. At 150 feet, the bit paused for a check. At 170, cuttings became wetter, cooler to the glove touch. At 180, the sound changed, less shriek, more hollow, like the bit's voice had found a room. They pulled back, added casing, pushed again. The supervisor made a call to slow rotation another fraction to prevent a blow-through that might slam the chamber with debris. The winch operator ran his hand along the cable as if it were a horse's neck. Every motion in the light above was a message in the dark below. "We are close. We are careful. We are here." Exhaustion aided everyone, but the pressurized air held. The water line stayed pinned, and the big hole came on by feet, then inches. Then the answering tremor that told men who had not seen daylight for days that the roof over their heads was about to open like a second sky. Somewhere in that thin place between terror and relief, a new fear crept in of being the one left behind if the chamber failed during extraction, of the unknown ride upward in a steel tube. Randy Fogel met it the only way he knew how. "We came in 9, he whispered to the circle. "We go out 9. He said it like a promise, and promises down there were the only steady ground anyone had. The final feet through rock are never just distance. They are a conversation with pressure, gravity, and luck. In the early minutes of July 28, the rig's rotation eased to a crawl while the driller feathered weight on bit, listening through his hands. The steel sang against stone, then thudded. Then the tone went thin as the last disk of rock surrendered. Air and mist surged up the shaft as if the earth exhaled. On the farm, cheers burst and then hushed immediately as crews moved like a pit team casing locked. Edges reamed smooth. The rescue capsule swung over the hole on a crane boom. Medics, ropes, radios, helmets, blankets, monitors, oxygen, everything in motion with the precision of a ritual rehearsed until it looked inevitable. Before a man rode that narrow elevator, The rescuers dropped a supply bundle. Warm garments sealed against wet, fresh lights, water, a line to tether the capsule so the two worlds could talk in more than vibration and hope. When the tether jerked, hands on the line felt the answering tug. "We are here," came the shout up the pipe, clearer now. The capsule, mesh sides, a bar to grip, a harness to clip was lowered slowly, spinning once, corrected with a twist of the line. It vanished into rock and noise, then into the pocket where 9 miners threw their light against steel and saw their way out was exactly 22 inches wide. They argued to go last and to go first in the same breath. Randy Fogel decided it for them. His chest had tightened in waves for hours. The medics wanted him topside quickly. He clipped in, set his boots against the capsule's floor, looked once around the ring of lamps and faces, and nodded. The winch took the slack, lifted, and he rose out of a chamber that had shrunk to the size of a memory he would carry for the rest of his life. The ride was a tunnel of clangs and gritty wind, inches from steel all the way, a feeling like being drawn up through the throat of a machine. Men on the line kept the capsule centered. The brake hummed. The cables sang. In a handful of long minutes, Fogel's helmet breached the rim into floodlight white, and the farm erupted. It was 1:0 a.m. Cameras caught the moment. Families cried out names that fell apart into sound. Medics wrapped him in blankets, slid a monitor cuff around his arm, pressed warm oxygen to his face. His color was wrong, mottled from days in cold water, but his eyes were fierce and stunned and alive. 1 down, 8 to go. The ritual locked in. The capsule went back with a thermos of warm liquid, came up with a man shaking so hard the blanket rattled against the mesh, went back with a word from a wife scribbled on a folded napkin, came up with a grin turned to a sob at the rim. Harry Mayhew rose next, then Tom Foy, then John Unger, then John Philippi, then Ronald Heilman and Dennis Hall and Robert Pugh. Each ascent was its own battle. Each arrival was its own miracle. Surface crews rotated so no one's hands trembled when they handled the latch. Underground, the circle of lamps grew smaller, the space larger, the echo different as bodies left, and hope changed shape, from defiance to proof. Between lifts, the medics worked in a heated tent pitched on the farm lane, steam blooming from blankets as ice-cold clothes were cut away. They chased hypothermia with warm IVs, insulated the men from evaporative chill, checked lungs for fluid, hearts for arrhythmias born of stress and cold. The fear of decompression sickness lingered in the periphery pressurized air, days at depth, but the ascent rate was controlled, and the chamber's pressure never reached the levels that make nitrogen bubbles bloom in the blood. The miners' skin showed the ordeal in purple blotches and pale bands. Their hands were puckered. Their voices were raw whispers rubbed thin by cold and noise. But their answers to the questions that mattered most were steady. Name. How many? Any still below? The reply came like an oath. 9 came in. 9 are coming out. On the surface, time expanded and collapsed with each cycle of the winch. Wives who had not slept since Thursday smiled with the fragile light that comes after the worst thing doesn't happen. Children stared at the capsule as if it were a magic barrel that turned prayers into people. The Arnold family, Bill and Lori, farmers who had lent their land and their days and their kitchen to the state, watched strangers treat their fields like a launch pad and nodded to anyone who needed space or coffee or permission to turn their pasture into a rescue site. What had been a dairy farm 48 hours earlier was now a place where people would point years later and say, "That's where they came up, right there by the hedgerow. I saw it with my own eyes." The ordinary ground of a working farm was promoted, for a night, to sacred. The last lift belonged to Mark Papernak. It is one thing to go first and another to go last. Both have their own corners of fear. He clipped in with calm that came from a decision made hours earlier and sealed by every ascent that preceded him. At 2:45 a.m., the capsule cleared the edge one final time, and the count that had been whispered like a spell, one more, reached its proof. 9. The line slacked. The brake went quiet. The rig that had drilled the earth silent for days stood still like a monument. In the heated tent, medics did the same careful work one last time. Outside, the word miracle passed from mouth to mouth, not because physics had been suspended, but because so many exacting, fragile things had gone right in sequence when any one of them might have failed. Later, In hospital rooms smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee, doctors signed off on lungs and hearts and skin, while families touched faces with the awe reserved for returns from long distances. Reporters asked what it was like, and the men answered in plain language: cold, loud, dark. A long time. We stayed together. We prayed. We waited. We heard them coming. In the weeks after, investigators traced the breach back to the map that lied by omission, to lines copied and recopied until they lost their truth. Regulators wrote new rules with sharper pencils. Old paper maps gave way to digitized surveys and mandatory cross-checks. Pre-drilling probing holes became standard practice near any suspected abandoned works. Tracking devices moved from idea to equipment list. Survival caches, oxygen, rations, light were placed not as luxuries but as obligations. The industry changed not by slogans but by the gravity of 9 names that refused to become a memorial list. And yet, a memorial rose. On the ground where the rig had stood and the capsule had pierced night air like a lighthouse, an artifact of steel and wire was set for hands to touch. The very capsule that carried 9 men from a place that wanted to keep them was mounted where school buses could stop and grandparents could tell what they saw on television that night, or in person under floodlights, or in the way their town breathed again when the count hit 9. People who had never set foot in a mine felt the deep pull of a narrative that belongs to every place where work meets risk, that competence matters, that courage is contagious. That community is not a poem, but a plan executed with wrenches and prayer and coffee and maps corrected by experience. Years later, when another disaster trapped men far to the south in Chile, officials there said aloud what rescuers in Pennsylvania had felt, that if Quecreek had ended in body bags, they might have chosen against a gamble of drills and hope. Instead, the precedent of success traveled as surely as any piece of equipment. The lesson did too, that the difference between an accident and a catastrophe can be drawn by the speed of a phone call, the stubbornness of a foreman, the right bit loaded on a truck, the willingness of a farmer to surrender his pasture to heavy steel, the math done twice at 3 in the morning by someone who refuses to accept a margin of error that will cost a life. For the 9, memory holds a different register. It is the feel of a rope linking men in darkness, the taste of a shared sip measured against the need in another's eyes, the hot slap of air that smelled like machinery and mercy. The moment a circle of light framed the rim of a world gone for days, and the floodlights blew it open. The first breath of night air drowned in the sound of people shouting their names. In the end, the story resolves into a simple arithmetic that the human heart understands. 9 went down into fear, 9 rose through it, 9 returned to sunlight. And the field where it happened will always be a place where, for 77 hours, a community proved that miracles are just plans that dare to finish.